Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base biotech podcast, and this is number 35, going out on November the 14th. It's Children in Need Day and it's Diabetes Day. For me, this year at least, it's Rest Day, because I managed to fracture 2 ribs while hiking this week. Landing on rocks on your back is definitely not recommended. Fortunately, my backpack took the brunt of the impact, but the tripod certainly left its mark, and the tablet that I had in the backpack to use as a teleprompt will now never be turned on again. So, the least said about that incident, the better. It's also been a very wet week, and that's been annoying because there are lots of people online posting photos of the Northern Lights, and we can't even see the top of the street lights. Last week we talked about World Immunisation Day and vaccines with GeoVax Chairman, President and CEO David Dodd, and we talked about infertility with Igixos Chief Medical Officer Elke Bestel. This week we've managed to get 3 interviews in. We talked to Malin Kjällström about Gothenburg Tech Week, Eliot Forster, the CEO of Levicept, about pain and osteoarthritis, and Christophe Demaison, CEO of ENA Respiratory, about respiratory viruses. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other suggestions or comments, please do feel free to get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com. And that's also the email you can use if you're interested in advertising with us or sponsoring a podcast episode. Or I guess it would be really good to know about events that I should be at. First, let's take a look at the news you may have missed over at deeptechdigest.com. Pila Pharma's capital raise was oversubscribed by 293% to fund obesity studies. Amgen revealed results from its cardiovascular drug trial, and Syngene Bio announced a collaboration with Lilly. Cooperative motor proteins can kill cancer cells when dual inhibited. You can find out about what's being called a foundational moment for in vivo cell therapy, and there were positive results for Eli Lilly's obesity drug. The world's first gene-editing therapy for hyperlipidemia was announced. An investigational treatment of autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease has received orphan drug designation, and the mechanism behind overactive immune cells has been revealed. A study has identified which patients benefit most from a new schizophrenia drug. PDS Biotech is seeking expedited approval for its head and neck cancer drug, and you will soon be able to hear more about that on the podcast, as we just did an interview about it. And you can read all of these and plenty more at deeptechdigest.com. So let's get to the interviews. We'll go with the short one first, and a part of the reason for that is it was done outdoors and it was a bit chilly. It's from NLS Days in Gothenburg, and Business Region Gothenburg was kind enough to take me across the river to the north side on a free ferry, which I point out to embarrass places where you pay an arm, a leg and a kidney. We went to check out Gothenburg Tech Week. To tell us about Gothenburg Tech Week is Malin Kjällström, Gothenburg Tech Week Press and Partnerships Lead. All right, so maybe then you could first tell me about the event.
Yeah, so we're doing Gothenburg Tech Week. This is actually the 10th year we're doing this. It's a celebration year. Gothenburg Tech Week is between 3 and 5 days, filled with different types of events, but the main focus is tech and entrepreneurship. So we're doing in total 11 events. Today is Startup and Investor Day, followed by a few partner events in the evening. But today we're welcoming around 140-150 investors and entrepreneurs to talk about growth. So we have a full day with programs, master classes, great lunch, and a lot of networking, of course. And then tomorrow we have a new event called Tech Blueprint. It's a full day of talking about integration of AI. So we have invited mid-size and large corporations to talk about how they integrate AI into their organizations, both in product and in workflow. So we have the same there. We will be at World of Volvo, and it's a lot of discussions about AI. And then on Thursday we have the Partner Day. So we have events all around Gothenburg, so the participants can see what's going on in Gothenburg and visit the partners.
And how many people would attend something like this?
So for the full week we are plus 1,000 people.
All right, and the local and national and international?
Exactly. So we most is local and national, but also from Nordic countries.
How has it changed over the years?
So we actually started by just pooling events because we wanted to have a better event culture for tech and entrepreneurship, or people interested in tech and entrepreneurship. So we started pooling bigger events. We had Venture Cup. We had a lot of partners that did large events for the community. And during the time, we evolved into creating our own forums as well, so we could invite partners to talk about different topics within tech and entrepreneurship. And we did that because we wanted the diversity. For us, it's really important to have everything from academia to industry to startups to large corporations, so we can get the different angles and the different discussion topics to flow better and be more diverse.
And what are some of the sessions that you're particularly highlighting or looking forward to this year?
For the event today, we have a masterclass about building teams in the AI era. Also looking forward to a session where we will talk about iteration and the speed of iteration. And tomorrow, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about physical AI and robots. And we also have a partner event on Thursday where we will talk about legal aspects of launching your first tech product.
Is it all presentations, or are there companies showcasing as well?
It's a mix. So we have everything from keynote session type of events, but we also have a large meeting on Thursday between startups and investors and large corporations. We have smaller breakfasts for 20 people, more of a masterclass setting.
All right, and what are the kind of comments that you get from attendees in terms of its value to them?
Yeah, I had a comment last year about people that are new to the city, to find a context to be in, especially if they're in tech and they are entrepreneurs or want to get into entrepreneurship. It was a great place for them to meet others, but also large corporations to find. Could be everything from workforce, it can be just showcasing products. So we have actually a lot of different types of industries and companies, so it's a large platform to be seen in. We've seen that.
Are there similar events to this in Sweden or in the Nordics?
In the Nordics, we have Oslo Innovation Week, we have a Tech Barbecue, we have Iceland Innovation Week, so the Nordic countries has its own. This year, Stockholm also launched Nordic Tech Week, which is more of a platform to engage all people into what's happening in the tech sector. But there's a lot of events coming, and it's great. We need to talk more about what's happening in the tech sector.
Is the communication between all of those events? I mean, do you kind of help each other and learn from each other?
Absolutely. So we, the moderator and my colleague in Gothenburg Tech Week, we were actually up to do some moderating for Nordic Tech Week. And we've done some promotions, and they've been doing some promotions as well. So it's good to help each other out.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine as soon as this one's over, you start at the next one?
Yes. It's just grabbing partners and planning the next.
A super event that's just going from strength to strength. More interviews to come from that event and NLS Days itself in the coming weeks. Next, Levicept is a biotechnology company based in Sandwich in the UK. It has developed a therapy for osteoarthritis and the pain associated with it that targets the neurotrophin 3 pathway. To tell us about it is Eliot Forster, the company's CEO. So maybe then first, if you could tell me a little bit about the company.
Yeah, sure. So Levicept's a UK-based private company with a single asset, which we call Levi04. The company's been around for about 10 years, founded by a guy called Simon Westbrook. Simon used to work before coming to Levicept at Pfizer, and was tasked with producing a new non-opiate treatment for osteoarthritis, and something that was not an anti-nerve growth factor medicine. And that is Levi-O4. So when Pfizer closed its site in Sandwich in the southeast of England, Simon came out of there with the idea on a piece of paper, started Levicept, and here we are today, just finishing phase 2.
Do you have any kind of stats or information on osteoarthritis and its prevalence?
Yeah, sure. It's highly prevalent. I mean, the World Health Organization reckon that it will be, in the top 3 most prevalent diseases by the middle of this century, so 2050. There are a range of estimates, but there are something like a third to a half a billion patients today with osteoarthritis, just as the population gets older and, therefore the prevalence goes up. The most common joint is the knee joint. That's the one that most people get OA in first, followed by OA of the hand, and then the hip, and then a whole bunch of others. Foot is very debilitating, but less common. Shoulder and spine, of course. And so it's a really common condition with, not much by the way of relief, to be perfectly honest.
Is it something that's just mostly pain, or is there limitations associated
with it? No, it's very debilitating. So obviously it's painful, and pain is, central to what a patient wants to have go away, but is also associated with disability. So patients who've got moderate to severe osteoarthritis, which is the majority, they find difficulty, depends on which joint, but getting up and down from a chair, getting in and out of a car, carrying bags, walking in some cases. So it's very debilitating. And the disease itself formally is classified into 3 areas. So one is pain, the other is function, so standing up, sitting down, carrying, shopping, etc., etc. And then the other is a thing called stiffness. And so that's really just the ability to get moving, often associated with time of day. So early in the day, it's harder to get moving. You need to get things going. But all of that is associated closely with the overall impact of osteoarthritis.
You tend to think of it as being primarily older people, but do younger people get osteoarthritis?
Its prevalence and incidence goes up with age, so decade by decade, but there is certainly a younger onset group. And that younger onset group, so 30s and 40s, tend to be associated with very high BMIs. So there's a strong correlation between weight, if you think about the knee joint or the hip joint, and OA. And so there is certainly a growing number, but the predominant association is with age.
What are the current treatments available? Is it like pain and relief from the symptoms, or both?
Patients tend to go through a series of stages. So most patients who've got OA at the beginning sort of self-medicate. They go to the local chemists or pharmacy and buy paracetamol, ibuprofen, so non-steroidals or the equivalent, and treat themselves. But eventually the pain breaks through, but the other symptoms begin to impact as well. So they get less functional and tend to go to, you'll go to your whichever doctor you see first. It depends which part of the world you're in. But if you're in the UK, then you go and see your GP, and he or she probably will do a bunch of things. She'll recommend exercise and weight loss. She'll give you some higher dose non-steroidals, things you can't buy yourself at a chemist, and start using those. All of that generally fails, unfortunately, with time. This may take 3, 4, maybe 5 years. It's a very long-term disease. And then, unfortunately, patients go on to much stronger things as their disease progresses and gets worse, because none of this stuff is altering the course of the disease. And patients then go into all sorts of things. So injections straight into the joints, so-called intra-articular injections. Those things are obviously fine for the big joints, but tough on hands and feet, for example. In the US in particular, there's a high usage of opiates, which simply don't work, but are given as something to give to try and help the patients. And then a whole bunch of other things that basically don't work, and people self-medicate with things like chondroitin, hyaluronic acid, and so on. Some things do cause pain relief, so intra-articular, so steroids injected into the big joints can work for a short while, but ultimately, in particular for the very big joints, the knee, hip, maybe shoulder, you end up with the surgeon. And if you use the US as an example, Annually, there are about 1 million knee replacements, and there are about 20 million patients waiting for knee replacements. So you get this big mismatch. And obviously, surgery comes with risks, but access to surgery is really about not just the need, so you need your knee replacing, but also economic access, because they aren't cheap. And if you've got a national health service, you just wait and wait and wait, as we do here in the UK. Or if you're unable to pay, then you wait and wait and wait if in the US or Germany or its equivalent. And so that's the ultimate course. And so what's needed is something that gives sustainable pain relief, but more importantly, and effectively changes the other symptoms, to remove some of the disabilities. The functionality comes back, the stiffness goes away, and so on.
You mentioned how prevalent it is. Does that mean that there are tons of companies working on this?
Yeah, there are lots and lots. The big pharma players have been working on it for many years. I worked for a long time at Pfizer and helped develop things called COX-2 inhibitors. And those were the last new mechanism approved for the treatment of OA. And there's been a host of others. Many companies have focused on replacing the cartilage, which has more recently been shown to be not a good thing to do because it doesn't work. It doesn't cause pain relief. It doesn't change the course of the disease. So there was a big wave of activity, which had ended up in a kind of negative cul-de-sac. And then pretty much every company's got a program of some description attempting to look at either the pain of OA or trying to change the underlying causes, change the disease modification as it's known in the vernacular. Some companies have tried and failed. So people have used some of the new non-opiates like the NaV 1.8s, and they haven't been all that effective. The owners of the GLP-1 drugs have tried those, particularly for the very, very heavy patients, so the BMIs of 40 or greater. And they have some effect, but it takes a very long time, 9 to 12 months, to begin to get some pain relief, but no change in the underlying disease. So there is a real gap, and of course a real need, which is, I hope, where Levi-O4 can fit.
And you may not know this because it's kind of going back a little bit, but you mentioned about knee replacements. What's the prevalence or the incidence of things like prosthetic joint infection? Because I was just doing an article on that last week about the number of people that have replacements and get terrible infections, some of them even dying.
It is an issue, of course, and because there are so many of them, if you think about 1 million, even if you've got a kind of 1%, then that's a significant number of patients. But it's not without risk, and people don't get, of course, necessarily the 100% mobility that they were hoping for because they've had the knee replaced. And most patients, by the way, with OA of the knee, don't just have it in one knee, they have it in both. So the clinical trial we conducted, all of the patients, because we were asking about one knee, had OA in that knee, but the vast majority of patients had it in both knees, not just in one knee. So that's the other thing. So the knee replacement for one patient is two, it's not one surgery.
So you were mentioning about what other companies are doing. What's your approach been to tackling this?
Yeah, so we've looked at the underlying mechanism of OA, and heavily involved are things called neurotrophins. And there are 4 of them, and we're particularly interested in the imaginatively named neurotrophin 3, so NT3, and its role in joint degradation. And in you and I, assuming neither of us have OA, then there is a balance between a thing called the P75 neurotrophin receptor and neurotrophin 3. And so they sit in equilibrium, always bound to each other, and they circulate in us on a day-to-day basis, bound in equilibrium. When a little bit of NT3 is needed, then it gets pulled off that binding and becomes accessible to the body. The P75 binder is at a fixed level, so it doesn't go up in inflammation or in OA, for example, whereas the NT3 does go up in inflammation. And so what we did, what Simon's simple but brilliant idea was just simply to make a synthetic version of P75 neurotrophin receptor. So just to bring that one-to-one relationship back into balance and restore the normal functionality, because we're constantly repairing ourselves, of course. And so that's what we did. And Simon and the team did that in the early days. And we've then subsequently taken that idea, turned it into a medicine we call Levi-O4, and put that into healthy volunteers and patients at the beginning, and then into a much bigger patient study, which, as we speak, we've been reporting on at the American College of Rheumatology Convergence in Chicago. That literally, I'm just watching my signal as Simon is standing down from the stage with a round of applause. So it's a very happy coincidence, Jim, to be talking to you about it right at this point.
Could you tell me about the mode of action and how it works?
Yeah, so this is that binding. So we give exogenous copy of the P75 neurotrophin receptor that is floating around in us, and we give it so that it can bring back into balance the excess neurotrophins, and in particular neurotrophin 3, and we inhibit neurotrophin 3 as we do naturally. This is not us creating a new pharmacology. And the rebalance of that allows several things to happen. So one, it allows other neurotrophins to help with the repair of joints. It removes the pain. So neurotrophin 3, NT3 given, for example, subcutaneously causes pain. So we know it's a pain causer. So we remove that from the system and allow the other neurotrophins, in particular a thing called nerve growth factor, to elicit a repair. So we get a pain reduction and then a repair. And the thing that Simon has just been talking about is that one of the underlying pathologies of osteoarthritis, which you can see on an MRI, is a thing called a bone marrow lesion. So these are big areas of inflammation and degradation that sit just below the cartilage and start to eat at the cartilage and the bone from below. So it's not a joint disease, it's actually a bone disease that affects the joint. What we've shown, and the data we've literally just announced, is that we have a dose-dependent reduction in bone marrow lesions in these patients with OA. So we remove the pain, and we've demonstrated really good control of pain, good stiffness relief, and good return of function. But importantly, when you look on MRI, you can see that these bone marrow lesions are reducing in size and reducing in frequency in a dose-dependent manner, which means it's a real pharmacology, which is very exciting.
And what's the mode of delivery?
Currently, we're giving it once a month by intravenous injection, and we're currently developing a form that can be given subcutaneously by the patient themselves, again, once a month, using an auto-injector. So something that goes into the bum or thigh or shoulder, according to where the patients want to do it. And so patients will be able, on a monthly basis, to give themselves drug and then go about their normal lives, and hopefully show a great improvement in the things we've seen in the clinical trials.
Right, yeah, that's excellent. Are you ultimately looking to the regulatory pathway as a pain reliever or an OA drug, or both?
We're starting our next set of regulatory interactions at the end of this year and into early 2026. And what we'll be looking for, we've demonstrated clearly symptom relief, so pain, function, stiffness. So we'd assume that even with the data we've got now, just repeating some of those data, we'll get symptom relief in OA. But we're also ambitious to get that disease modification label as well. And so we're going to propose a long-term study to test the changes in the underlying disease. So it's the reduction in those bone marrow lesions, some other markers of improvement in the underlying disease over a longer period, including, for example, removing the need to have a joint replacement, which would be really cool. And if we can demonstrate all of that, we hope that the regulators would agree with us that we can do not just symptom relief, including pain, but also disease modification or improvement in the signs of OA, as it's known in the kind of regulatory jargon. That's our ultimate ambition. We're just beginning those conversations, of course, and then we'll do those clinical trials. But we're excited about the prospects for it, particularly as it's just simply harnessing a natural process that is going on in us every day.
You mentioned all those prosthetic knee replacements. You're going to be real popular with the makers of those if you manage to stop people having knee transplants.
Well, every so often a paradigm shift needs to come. And I started in the pharmaceutical industry long time ago when the H2 blockers, so the histamine 2 blockers, were being used for peptic ulcers. So these are ulcers that occurred in the stomach and in particular the duodenum, small intestine. And patients would sometimes, rarely, but sometimes bleed to death with these things. And they had surgery. So there were a whole bunch of gastroenterological surgeons who were going in and doing these surgeries. And, they were, I'm sure, many brilliant surgeons, and that's what they were doing in their practice. But the H2 blockers stopped all of that. And almost no one gets a surgery now unless there's a true perforation. And I think that Levi-O4 can have a similar impact. Does it mean that there'll never be any joint replacements? Of course not. But I think reducing the numbers to those that are truly critical and will be life-changing, I think will be important. And it gives relief to those patients who can't have joint replacements. If you've got OA of the hand, or OA of the foot, or OA of the spine, you're not getting those joints replaced anytime soon. I think the practice will come together. I think there'll still be a place for the surgeons, of course there will, but I'm hoping on a much, much lesser scale, as we saw that transformation in the 1980s with ulcers.
Does it have applications in other conditions beyond OA?
So we've taken a really low-level look at a couple of other conditions. So this neurotrophin, neurotrophin number 3, NT3, is highly upregulated in patients who are having chemotherapy and have a chemotherapy-induced pain. It's a neuropathic pain, so chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain. And so one of the things we'd like to explore later on in the development process is to whether we can treat that particular patient population. Now, they're a population in really high need because what they get is opiates, and that's it, pretty much. And so they have reduced pain, but their quality of life changes, and so on. And in fact, it's such a need that the FDA have a special guideline for chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy, neuropathic pain. So that's an area of interest for us because of that relationship with neurotrophin 3. And then the only other setting we've explored is that there is a subgroup of patients who have rheumatoid arthritis, so the other kind of arthritis, which is the autoimmune disease. And there is a particular population who never get an improvement in pain, and it looks like there's a NT3 component in their pain as well. So that will be something to explore further down the line.
Do you see this as in the US? You mentioned opiates, and the US seems to have a bit of an issue with opioid addiction going around. Do you think that this is something that could contribute to tackling that?
Yeah, we believe so. I mean, this is not an opiate. In fact, it doesn't even get into the brain, so there are no central effects with Levi-O4. And we would hope that, in particular, in those patients who have tried the non-steroidals and the ibuprofens, instead of giving them opiates, let's give them Levi-O4 and bring the pain and symptom relief, hopefully change their underlying disease, and remove the need for opiates to be given as a sort of rescue medication, which then obviously destroys a fairly substantial portion of those lives, unfortunately. So I think it really does have a place in the kind of non-opiate armamentarium for OA and perhaps a couple of these other conditions that I mentioned.
And you already mentioned the clinical trials. Can you tell me a bit more about the pathway that you're on with those?
Yeah, so we've completed a large phase 2 clinical trial, tested 3 doses of Levi-O4 in more than 500 patients. And next up for us is phase 3, which you'll be familiar with, Jim. So the final and confirmatory part of the drug development process. And we're just in the process of exploring that. So we need to do several things. One is we've got to get the number of patients treated to be much higher, something between 1,500 and 2,000. And as I said earlier, we want to treat longer. We want to make sure that the drug continues to give symptom relief over a longer period, give Levi-O4 the chance to fully demonstrate that disease modification, and of course remain safe over that long-term period. And so we want to do more and longer during phase 3, and that's the thing we'll be talking to the regulators about, as well as find a pathway forwards for that auto-injector, the subcutaneous version, so patients can just use it at home and not have to go into an infusion center.
And with those phase 3 trials, will the priority be pain and relief of symptoms, or either or?
Yeah, we'll try and do both. I mean, so we'll do symptom control, so pain, stiffness, function, as well as disease modification. And in particular, over those longer term studies, we're going to look at all of those aspects and hopefully have sufficient body of evidence to convince regulators that this will be a disease modifying, symptom relieving medicine, as we believe it is from the data published and some of the stuff we've just published this afternoon.
Speaking of what you've just published, what does that say?
Yeah, so it comes back to those bone marrow lesions. So we were delighted that Simon, the founder, was able to be up on stage in the plenary session and presenting the dose-dependent reduction in these bone marrow lesions, this underlying pathology of osteoarthritis, where we saw a reduction in the overall amount of bone marrow lesions present in the patient population, as well as the number of patients who had bone marrow lesions at the end of the study. So both of those went down in a dose-dependent manner, the 2 mg per kg dose being particularly effective. And really interesting, a small but meaningful increase in bone marrow lesions on placebo. So a dose-dependent reduction on active, small increase. Those are the data that have come out today. And looking at the chat on my rest of my machine, it looks like it's gone down very well, which is terrific.
You mentioned earlier how it's a global issue. Pain's a global issue as well, I guess. But are you prioritizing specific locations when you get to the stage of rolling out? Or are you hoping that this can help people everywhere?
So we really are hoping everywhere. We of course are focused on the usual locations. So North America, Europe, Southeast Asia, China, Japan. But one of the things we are doing is looking at the type of the injector that the patient can use. So there is an auto injector, which is the kind of Rolls-Royce injector, but of course they're relatively expensive and they're convenient because they're preloaded and the patient just uses them and walk away. But we're also looking at a pretty cheap disposable version as well that could certainly be used in other countries, because osteoarthritis, as you and I have discussed, is really an age-related disease, and the whole world is getting older, not just France, as it were. And so, if we can make this available where I am speaking to you from, South Africa, or we make it available in Nigeria and India and so on and so forth to more developing health systems, that would be a real achievement for us, and we'd be delighted with that. And then making some strides towards that with this disposable injector.
Are you looking to any partnerships to help advance any of this, or are you just doing it on your own?
Both at once. I think if a partner comes along and shows interest, and we've had quite a bit of inbound interest, which we're entertaining at the moment, let me use that word, then that's one side. But at the same time, we're making strides towards going alone and getting this to market ourselves. And the first step in all of that is to have the conversations with the regulators that I mentioned earlier. And so really our hard work over the next 3 or 4 months is to get those conversations done and move forwards.
You mentioned that this is the priority right now. Is there anything else on the horizon for the company?
Well, we just continue to explore, what comes next. Really, it's about understanding the details of our data, as much as we might need to going forwards, but it's then about getting the right design to demonstrate pain, symptoms, and disease modification in those future clinical trials. So that's what we're working on and we're looking forward to.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
I guess the only thing I would say is that if we look and assume that Levi-O4 will continue on the successful path it's been on, it would be the first new mechanism to treat osteoarthritis since the last one that I worked on in the 1990s. And if we can get this thing approved before the end of this decade, then there'll have been a 3-decade wait, but we hope a worthwhile one if we can get this through. So we're working really hard towards that. The basic science is very nice, the clinical data is good, and so we're excited for the opportunity.
That's one of those treatments that can help in so many ways. Pain relief that doesn't contribute to the opioid crisis, and it helps with osteoarthritis too. Next is a nasal spray designed for weekly self-administration. ENA 051 works by priming innate immune responses at the entry site of respiratory viruses in the upper airways. It has been developed by ENA Respiratory in Australia, and we had a conversation about it with the company's CEO, Christophe Demaison. So I guess first then, if you could tell me a little bit about the company.
Yes. So first of all, thanks, Jim. I think it's great to be here on Base to Base biotech. ENA Respiratory, it's a clinical stage company. Our mission, in fact, is to transform the treatment of and prevention of respiratory viral infection. The aim is really reducing the impact on patients, their family carers, and obviously the healthcare system. So the company is based in Melbourne, headquartered in Melbourne in Australia, but we've got also operation in the US, so clinical team is based there, and then we do the manufacturing and development in Europe and the UK.
Maybe as you're working with respiratory viruses, I wonder if you could set the scene and tell me what the issue is with common viruses on a global scale.
Yeah, so just really focusing on the main virus, because the numbers are really difficult when you look at most of the common respiratory viruses, but there's a lot of data on seasonal influenza. And just on the global scale, according to WHO, there's about 1 million people that get infected every year with seasonal influenza. So to give you some ideas, and it does cause about 3 to 5 million severe cases, about 650,000 deaths worldwide. So the numbers are probably higher because there are some countries don't really monitor that sort of infection. But to give you some ideas, and we've got more numbers in the US over the Christmas period, like just after Christmas and New Year, like 1 in 10 adults in emergency departments have complication either due to flu, COVID, or RSV the last few years. So just give you some ideas. And according to the CDC, last season that was particularly bad for influenza, there was 1 or 2 million hospitalization in the US due to flu, COVID, or RSV. So that's obviously a global issue. And also it doesn't really take into account rhinovirus that we know it's involved in about 50% of exacerbation of asthma and COPD. So people that know people with asthma or COPD, they get a cold and most likely they will need antibiotic. They might go in emergency or just worse, will be hospitalized.
There are obviously quite a few vaccines that can tackle respiratory viruses. What kind of work is being done on helping that battle against respiratory viruses?
Yeah, so vaccine and antiviral, they do target specifically each virus or virus strain, and they are available against seasonal flu, COVID, and now RSV, as people might know, and they are really important, play a key role in protecting vulnerable population against complications caused by these viruses. As I mentioned before, there are no vaccine against rhinovirus or antivirals. There are more than 100 strains circulating every year, so it's really difficult, probably impossible to develop a specific vaccine. But there are two key limitations of vaccine, I would say. One of the key limitations is most respiratory viruses are RNA-based viruses, so they do mutate very quickly. So most of the time, the circulating variant or the vaccine are not really protective against the circulating variant. And that's what people see every year. Just coming back to flu once again, when we look at the US, according to the CDC, last winter, the effectiveness of vaccine was about 40 to 50% against the circulating variant. And obviously, one of the other key limitations is as people get older or if they are immunocompromised, they don't really mount an effective immune response against the circulating variants with the vaccine, so they are not really well protected. And then we can't forget that the last few years with an increased vaccine hesitancy and maybe vaccine fatigue in some of the countries like US, but it's also happened in other countries like in Europe and even in Australia. So the rate of vaccination are lower and lower in the general population. So that is obviously a massive issue. So taking that into account, there's room for something that will complement vaccine and antivirals.
It's a global issue, and as you were mentioning some of the numbers there must also be huge economic costs to the effect of some of these viruses.
Yeah, so when you look at the cost of healthcare and loss of productivity, it's in the billion, and we know just coming back to the US, for example, where the numbers are a bit better known and they are better studied, but the cost of just flu is about over 10 billion per year. It's about 3 billion of healthcare costs and about 8 of indirect costs. So, and then there's loss of productivity, people not going to work. So that is the cost of these respiratory viral infections.
Moving on to what your company's doing, I wonder if you could tell me about your lead candidate and its development and how it's delivered, its mode of action, all those things.
Yeah, so the molecule, the lead compound that we are developing, the clinical candidate, it's called ENA 051. So it's a small molecule and it works really by priming the epithelial cells in the mucosa to respond more quickly to viral infection. So when people that are treated with the molecule are infected, their infected epithelial cells and viruses are cleared more quickly. So the mechanism that I'm describing about clearing quickly the virus is part of the natural innate immunity, the natural what I call antiviral host defense, and we all rely on it to clear virus. So when we get a cold as a healthy person, young person, it's like people get a cold, they get maybe symptoms with 2 to 3 days, they will clear the virus and they rely on that innate immunity. So that's what the molecule does in 051, that stimulates that innate immunity. And because the viruses more likely or most of the time infect the nose and the nasopharynx, we're looking for local administration using a nasal spray. And also it does have the advantage for the drug to act very locally, to be washed off, and that's part of the safety profile. So, and we know that the molecule doesn't really absorb, so very, very good safety profile, and that's the reason we want to, and we can use it as prophylaxis, like for over 4 months, 4 to 6 months during the winter period.
How often does it have to be repeated?
That's also an important key characteristic of the product that we're developing. In preclinical studies, we've shown that we show efficacy in animal models for 1 week. So we're looking at 1 weekly administration, obviously very convenient for the patient and adherence in some ways. Also, the product is very stable at room temperature, so people will be able to keep it in their cabinets, pharmacy cabinets. So that's we're looking at something very, very convenient that is non-injectable that can people take at home, really.
So something like sneezing or blowing your nose, that doesn't affect its efficacy?
That's something we'll assess in the next clinical study. We're going to run a phase 2 in the community setting. So that's one of the things that we want to assess in addition to efficacy and safety.
All right. And with something like this, where you're hopefully reducing the number of infections or the severity of infections, is there a risk that you delay diagnosis of more serious conditions?
So we have no evidence of delayed diagnosis, but that is, again, something that we'll assess in the next clinical study. That's obviously very important to clear.
Right. Are there any challenges associated with intranasal delivery of drugs like this?
Yes, so we have spent a lot of time to optimize the formulation so we can maximize the drug deposition into the nose and nasopharynx. That's the tissue that we are targeting, and also minimizing the deposition of the drug to the lungs. So we don't want the drug to go too far down. Obviously, we have play with the formulation and with the droplets so that they are big enough. They are not inhaled in the lungs. So that was part of the development that was done the last few years.
And are there any challenges associated with virus mutation? Because we've seen how far COVID-19 has developed in just 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, so that is an interesting point, and it's really like part of the key feature of ENA 051. So unlike viruses and antivirals that target the specific virus, the ENA 051 target the host defense, as I mentioned, stimulate the host defense. So if the virus do mutate, that different strain that emerge, it will not affect efficacy. And we have shown that in preclinical study. So hopefully it will translate into clinical studies now.
All right. You mentioned the preclinical. Where are you at currently?
So with ENA 051, we have completed in 2 phase 1 with 2 different formulations and proof of concept through challenge study when we treat people and administrate with a mild virus. We have shown like bowel clearance. So to date, about 170 people have been treated with 051, showing good safety, very good safety, and some sign of efficacy. So now we want to progress into a phase 2 community settings, and that's what we're planning to do. That study will be initiated in a few months over the winter period. It will take place in the US. We'll enroll about 1,100 people that are at risk of infection. We'll dose them for up to 3 months, and we'll monitor safety and some efficacy against the common respiratory viruses that are circulating at the time.
And would this be something that would be mostly used for people that are vulnerable to infections, like the young and the elderly and people that are immunocompromised?
Yes, exactly. So the intent is initially to focus on this vulnerable population. As you mentioned, we know that age is critical risk for respiratory viral infection or complication, and then people with some medical condition like chronic respiratory disease like asthma, COPD, heart disease, kidney disease, the immunocompromised. So that's the population that are most likely to benefit from treatment. Obviously, in the future, we can broaden the use to some more general population, and obviously in the case of a new pandemic, that could be expanded.
The most recent news out of the company was $22 million in funding. What does that help you to do?
So that will fund that phase 2 community settings that I mentioned. It's quite a large study with a lot of participants. So most of the fund will be allocated to that activity.
Where are you at on the pathway to commercialization? I mean, what do you see as the kind of timeline?
The good thing about the phase 2 that we're doing, it's a seasonal treatment. So we should get data in about Q4 next year. So in about a year time. And we're already planning for phase 2 success. We'll pursue partnering discussion with major pharma because we believe will be the best avenue to develop the product, and then obviously undertake late stage clinical trial and also obviously commercialization on the track if successful.
And obviously this is a global issue. You can get these viruses pretty much anywhere in the world. How do you see yourself becoming a part of a global solution so that it's not just something that is in wealthy regions?
We're speaking about also pandemic preparedness here, just also protecting vulnerable population, but also healthcare workers. So that's part of the company mission. And the recent investment from the Gates Foundation really align with the global access strategy to the company and access to low to medium income countries.
And do you see this as being a standalone product, or do you see it being used with existing vaccines, antivirals?
That's really, really important. And we never consider ENA 051 as a standalone product. It's not here to replace vaccine or antiviral. It's very much complementary, but it's mechanism of action. And we're strongly believers that it's got its place as part of the toolkits against respiratory viral infection and being complementary to vaccine and antivirals.
Does it have any applications beyond respiratory viruses?
That's a good question. And so we know that stimulating the innate immunity can have other application has been applied in oncology in some ways to boost some of the existing immunotherapy drugs, and maybe as application to other viruses that may affect other parts of the body. That's not something we have actively explored, but that's something that could be explored in the future.
And do you have anything else in your pipeline other than ENA 051?
We have been concentrating on progressing ENA 051 mainly for funding reasons because of the trial and the effort that needs to be pushed toward that. So, yes.
I got my flu jab this week, or JAG as they call them in Scotland. I heard this winter's flu strain could be quite bad, so it's better safe than sorry. So that was a timely and interesting conversation on respiratory viruses, and hopefully from the company an advancement that's available sooner rather than later. Anyway, that's it for this week's podcast. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities, or if you want to advertise, please do feel free to contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. So, until next time, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast. The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.